Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming along tonight. We'll just wait a few minutes until everybody's drifted in. This is the last Zoom event for 2021. So we'll have news of our 2022 programme coming out quite soon. We do have our Friends preview of the RSA Christmas show on Friday at 5 o'clock. So do come along to that if you can, class of Fizz. Victoria, who's going to talk to us tonight, did a residency in the RSA Collections. The residency was funded by the Friends, so we're delighted to hear from Victoria how she got on. And I'll just hand over now to Sandy Wood, who is the RSA Collections Curator for the RSA. So welcome, Sandy.
Thanks, Sheena. It's nice to be here. It's a bit of a chilly night out in Haddington where I am, but my kids are safely ensconced in front of the television after completing a Just Dance with me just now. So, you know, it's a bit of a different kettle of fish when you're on these seminars from Zoom at home, but I'm pleased to be here. I'm delighted to introduce Victoria Bernie, who is, I think she was about our third residency artist working in the collections, but one that, you know, I've really enjoyed her presence with us. She started in September 2019 as a collections residency artist, which seems, you know, it seems a lifetime ago now, being pre-COVID. I was talking to Victoria about the residency the other day and just thinking that it seemed that she was with us a lot longer than just the few months that she visited us and we discussed her project. But what she's been doing, the investigations that she's done in relation to the collections, what she's explored have gone on really since that period that she started in September and branched out in a great deal of different directions. So it's been quite exciting it's exciting for me, I think, to find out what she's been up to. I'll read you quickly what she'd proposed to do with the collections, and I'll just introduce Victoria quickly before I hand over to her. I don't want to take up too much time. I want you to be able to enjoy Victoria's presentation today. So in Provenance, Victoria wanted to treat the RSA collections as a quarry to be mined, a complex accumulation of artifacts, images, constructs, photographs, letters, and the ephemera of lives spent making art. Driven by the theme of landscape and the idea of origins, Provenance had three lines of inquiry in its search through the collections: a place of origin, a landscape subject, the beginning of an idea, an artistic practice, and the history of an artifact from fabrication, the collection to significance. And when Victoria came to us, Robin and I, you know, were really discussed what she wanted to do and started to provide her with places to start with the artists that she was interested in and drop breadcrumbs, as she would call it, as to that she could pick up and follow and take her research and discovery into different directions. Now, Victoria, she's a visual artist who works in a variety of different media. Drawing is core and central in lots of different ways. She uses it to explore her ideas and to also develop them. But across into other media, film is also central to her practice. She wants something that's quite exciting, which she might pick up on during the presentation, is one of the drawings from the RSA residencies was shortlisted for the Trinity Boy Wharf Drawing Prize, which was formerly the Jerwood Drawing Prize just this year. So I'm quite excited to see how that pans out. Now, without further ado, I will pass you over to Victoria.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy. I'm just going to go straight into sharing my screen, if I may, and if it works, so that I can begin to introduce my work. So hopefully, if you could let me know if this is appearing for you in full screen.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Sandy. And thank you, Sheena. Sandy's perfectly right. I wanted to really get lost in the collection. I wanted to find my way into a different understanding of the landscapes of Scotland, which are the primary object of my work. I have for, well, since 1996 been studying the landscapes of northern and western Scotland. And I saw this as an opportunity to cease to be quite so much in control, which given my personality is an exceptionally difficult thing to do, and to entertain a cloud of ideas. The image on the screen just now is the image behind me in my studio. And it really is a reflection of how my brain works. It is a series of images collected from my time with Sandy and Robin in the collections, but they're added to with other findings, which begin to map out a set of connections which are strange, non-linear, not logical, and completely suit this redirection in my work. The colour on the extreme left is Pantone Mars Red, of which more later. I'd like to begin, if I may, and forgive me for reading, because I'd never forgive myself if I missed people out, to just acknowledge the folk who've helped me along the way. So first of all, I really want to thank the RSA and the Friends of the RSA for facilitating this work, funding this work. That's fundamental, but there's also an element of benediction in becoming a resident for the RSA, a resident artist for the RSA. And I think it empowered me to make contacts and to move differently through my professional life and my inquiries. I'd also like to thank Sandy and Robin for being my pathfinders, very good men. Caroline Gerard, who's a genealogist, Dr. Gillian Mackay, who's a geologist, Dr. Rachel Walcott, who's a geologist, and Malcolm Cruikshank, Richard Collins, Kat Gilbert, and Paul Charlton at Edinburgh College of Art, who are remarkable artists, craftsmen, and makers, who taught me remotely throughout 2020 how to cast, how to carve mahogany, how to work with textiles, and once I could see them in person, how to solder. Richard taught me how to work with 3D prints, and without their additional tutorage, I doubt I would have got this far. The last person I'd like to thank is Patricia Jane Bernie, my mother, who was here in the course of the work of the last 2 years at very important moments, but was always there for me. And she, during the spring and late spring and summer of 2020, we shared the same space. I was in her house and they were her rules, but she was very attentive and a wonderful sounding board for much of what you're about to see. Because my work is non-linear and because I can make no real sense of it, I've decided to tell you, on good advice from a great friend, 4 stories about 4 people. And I want you to think about them in terms of 6 degrees of separation. Admittedly, James Hutton was a little earlier on in time, but they all have some fundamental connection. There's a logic to the notion that they may once have walked in each other's shadows in the earliest years of the new town. They are Elizabeth Maria Ochterlony, Dr. James Hutton, David Octavius Hill, and James Naismith. The first piece of work I want to introduce you to really introduces you to my attitude to the collections. It's called Museum, and it's a large format installed film, an immersive film. And it is a landscape in a room. Because my work is landscape driven, and because my protocols of behavior as an artist are always to interrogate the ground, to move through a place, watching, waiting, maneuvering under things and through things. I took exactly the same attitude in the remarkable room that is the collections of the Royal Scottish Academy. Here I would find myself confronted by the most extraordinary juxtapositions, because of course the ordering of an archive or a collection is not often chronological. And these circumstances, it's how big is it, how much does it weigh, and will it go funny if we put it next to something else? So they are driven by conservation practicalities. And because of that, a smoking hat sits next to an old manuscript. A picture frame gilded a waterfall sits next to a work of extreme abstraction. There's this wonderful other set of stories that weave their way through the material realities of the collection. These are scenes, stills from the film. This film, Museum, really bookends my work with another film, Nymphaeum, which I'll be talking about at the end. And they're two substantial, installed, immersive film pieces. So to begin with, my first story, Elizabeth Maria Ochterlony, Mrs. Cumming. Mrs. Cumming appears in the inventory for the RSA, which was given to me to peruse by Sandy at some point in, I think, very early September 2019. And I was scanning for landscapes because I didn't want to be driven by familiar names. And I found myself finding a lot of landscapes in the early 19th century, but barely a woman. And then I came across Mrs. Cumming, and my attention was caught. And I saw that she had been, her daughter, Mary Ann Cumming, had left in a bequest 3 paintings by her mother, Dunkeld, Hawthornden, and St. Bernard's Well. And I began to look for Mrs. Cumming, but I couldn't find anything. And my curiosity turned to irritation, which I shared with Sandy and Robin, and they agreed. They had been trying for 15 years to find out who Mrs. Cumming was. And it really was the work of professional genealogy to discover who she was. They had worried at the edges of this for some time. And we all felt slightly uncomfortable by the silence. I'll just take you through the 3 images. I may return to them at some point, but this is Dunkeld. It's in the RSA Collections, but it's on loan to a private collection. This is Hawthornden, my favourite. I like the boldness and heft of the geology, and I like the geology. And this is St. Bernard's Well, an image and a point of view which will be familiar to you from much of Alexander Naismith's work. But the thing that bothered me was the silence of women, and the silence of women in art irritated my sensibilities. And I honestly thought that I would never find out who she was, and that silence would generate something else. I thought about a woman in the the dates were generally given to be 1830s, 1850s, but they resolved to be around 1820s. And I began to think about what it would be to be a painter, a woman painter in Edinburgh in the 1820s. And I kept thinking about clothes and how restrictive they were. And back to that Hawthornden painting. And I know that she won't have painted in plein air, but she would have sketched and visited. But the thought of doing that trussed up in a corset with those tight sleeves and those unfortunate slippers frustrated me even more. I looked through the collection, and I wasn't looking consciously for Mrs. Cumming. Other ideas were working along the way, but she was a constant. And I came across images. These are by David Octavius Hill from his Sketches of Scenery in Perthshire. And I found women sketching, not painting, observed by a man in a graceful pursuit, which was up there with being able to do fine embroidery and perhaps play a pianoforte. And here she is again, sketching a landscape overlooked. Painting, overlooked, or the object of a gaze. And this frustration ultimately led me to set about looking for Mrs. Cumming in earnest. This is another film, short film, which is part of a body of work concerned with Mrs. Cumming. And again, the architecture of the place we were looking at, so it was a journey with Sandy to look at some of the pieces from the collections which were borrowed, lent out, required me to move through the heavy, dusty ephemera of country houses, velvet and sconces and tassels and cushions and dark shadows and the smell of beeswax, looking for Mrs. Cumming. And then I remembered something. I remembered what's pretty much summarised in this slide, so I'll read it to you. This is from the beginning and 3/4 of the way through an email exchange with the remarkable genealogist, Caroline Gerard. My first email to her, 26th of September 2019 at 2:23 in the afternoon. Dear Caroline Gerard, I went in on one of your Dean Village tours and met you briefly through David Perry during one of the St. Bernard's Well open days last year. At the time, you mentioned your work at Warriston and Dean Cemeteries. I'm trying to find anything at all about a Mrs. Cumming, She was a painter in Edinburgh in the early to mid 19th century, possibly a pupil of Alexander Naismith. Or in summary, who is she and where is she buried? Caroline Gerard, after the most extraordinary waterfalls of emails of information and investigation. 5th of October 2019, 7:48 in the morning. Good morning, Victoria. Got her. And the woman that she found was Elizabeth Maria Ochterlony, born in Montrose, the daughter of a merchant of Riga, a merchant who probably dealt in flax, but may have dealt in timber. There was a strong connection between Scotland and Riga. There was pretty much an entire community of Scots there. She moved there. She got married there to William Cumming. She had 5 children there. And then when Napoleon was making his march into Russia, the family moved the business and moved to London, I think Kensington maybe, where they continued to operate with offices in Liverpool. They dealt in flax, and it's important, it's always going to be important to say these things. Flax is one of the main constituents of making rough linen. Rough linen was one of the major exports to the Caribbean and America to provide the 2 suits of clothes that were made available to enslaved people on plantations. There is no direct connection at this point, but that was an industry that was taking place. The greater Ochterlony family, Caroline did find evidence of their presence in the enslaved people's compensation scheme, which gave money back to people who once slaves were liberated. So Elizabeth Maria led an incredibly exciting life. She travelled widely. On the death of her husband in 1817, she travelled further and moved about all over the UK and settled in Scotland. Caroline works out between 1820 and 1836-37, where she attended art classes in the studio of Alexander Naismith, number 47 York Place. You can still see the plaque there. And this woman must have lived through one of the most remarkable periods in the city and the country. She would have been stepping out of the front door of her house, number 11, Great King Street, into the grit and sand of the second iteration of the new town. The sounds about her must have been mallets and cartwheels, and the dust must have been everywhere, but the intellectual and the creative dust would have been extraordinary. This was a time when Darwin was on the horizon, but all absolutes were being called into question. Vestiges of the earth was being passed about in salons. Artists, intellectuals abounded. And this was a wealthy woman, a widow, therefore given certain liberties, who was going to walk through the city as if an artist in a meteor shower, her feet touching the ground lightly, I suspect. Always, to a certain extent, constrained by the ephemera of a lady of that time period and that culture. The work with looking for Mrs. Cumming and the remarkable work that Caroline unfolded before me led me to one of my deviations or distractions, which was into the collections of the Royal Museum of Scotland. The store at Granton, which is just around the corner from the store of the RSA. And here I was given access to a meteorite collection. This is literally a piece of the moon and was part of an accession of 2017. And in the course of working in the collection, I was given a one-day remarkable tour and then given access to sit and draw items from the collection, in this case, specifically meteorites. I found myself in a situation that I often find myself in if I can learn to keep my mouth shut, which is people start to tell me news stories. And in this case, the curator, Rachel Walcott, began to tell me about other collections because that's her speciality, the history of collections of geology. And she talked in particular about Hutton. Now, I'd known James Hutton, known of him. I'd done quite a lot of work in Glentilt in 2013-14 in and around one of his unconformities. But I didn't know that much, and I hadn't really delved any deeper. And she told me to go and look at this painting, which is by Sir Henry Raeburn from 1776. And it shows a man who I feel is biding his time, would rather be collecting rocks, is daydreaming, but planning the next maneuver out into the landscape. The reason it fascinates geologists is because of the rocks that you see on the table, the geode and the flint maybe, and some others. This was part of Hutton's collection of the hand. He apparently had enough rocks in his collection to, if he'd chosen to, build his own house. He also collected great boulders on carts, which he managed to put in his house as well. And he was renowned for the fact that his pockets, and I think we see it here, were often stuffed with small stones and bits of dust. He took a great pride in the collection, and he gave it over. This is the first page of The Theory of the Earth, his major publication. He gave it over on his death to be preserved intact. That was crucial. It held a story, and he wanted the collection to be maintained. Unfortunately, something in the legal detail of how he left his bequest meant that it fell under the control of the shall remain nameless curator of the Natural History Museum, which is now the museum on Chambers Street, who was a supporter of Werner. So Hutton's proposal that the Earth is a constantly churning crust surface that is changing at all times, his unconformity, was diametrically opposed to Werner's logic that the globe is just gradually being worn down. And less by intention and more by sin of omission, the nameless curator allowed the collection to be stored, borrowed from, things weren't replaced, until over time it simply dissolved into the ether, and people, particularly geologists, have been trying to find these samples ever since. In the spirit of being a little bit annoyed about Mrs. Cumming, I was also a little bit annoyed about this. I myself, and this is an example, have a collection of the hand of stones and rocks, which I cherish and which map out my work across Scotland. In response, I made Hutton's Pocket, which is based on crystallography, not the study of crystals as a reading of emotional mood, but the study of crystals as evidence of particular kind of temperature and chemistry in a geological condition. These are all the crystal habits. And this is a selection of crystal habits which I wanted to work with in order to, I suppose, offer back to an imagined Hutton, a stand-in for the lost collection, for something for him to keep in his pocket. And it is carved in mahogany and is a demonstration of a particular line in the landscape of Scotland, which was gradually beginning to be revealed to me as I made my studies, working in the residency. It's a line that everybody else knows about, but I didn't. And this pocket is a way of telling the story of that landscape, because the distinctive thing about these crystals, and the crystal is defined by its facets, so the varying facets of these small mahogany hand pieces, is that they indicate very particular rocks are in adjacency, will melt or maneuver at particular speeds, and will cause the crystal to have this faceted pattern. And this was a way of a miniature, a landscape in miniature. I was also particularly drawn to this notion of Hutton's rocks potentially forming a house. What a wonderful proposition. And it felt like a loss as well. So in response to that, I began a set of designs for a rock room, which are based on an evolving fascination with geology in my own work, but also through that fascination and some of the directions I put in place with Sandy and Rodger, the directions that they gave me, they opened up this folio to me, which is the Falls of Foyer at Inverness, which are really indicative of a moment in the landscape and in the man on the left is drawing. That moment of the picturesque and the sublime, that wonder at the extraordinary formations of falling water in a waterfall, and the specificity of rocks, the specificity of the way that people were drawing rocks, the move away from generalities to this is drawing of a specific place and a particular rock formation. They also introduced me to, never heard of him before myself, William Daniel, and I like to hover at the edges of his work from his voyage around Great Britain. And much more recent, closer to our own time, the drawings of George Reed, but how to draw a rock amongst some grasses. This then, in my 6 degrees of separation, leads me to David Octavius Hill, who I had only ever known of because of his photography. I subsequently learned through Rodger in particular, his interests, his role as the secretary for such a long time to the Royal Scottish Academy. But what fascinated me in particular, apart from his collection of letters, which I'll speak about a little later, was his early work before he became the secretary. The evidence of a remarkable vision, really, an ability to draw a landscape, to compose, I find quite stage-like spaces that was perhaps maybe curtailed by his generous efforts with the RSA in terms of the development of outline of his work. And it was an introduction to a series of images that he made prior to becoming the secretary. This is an early body of work, which is called Sketches of Scenery in Perthshire, 1821 to 23, Fall on the Turret near Octavius, which is very near where Mrs. Cummings, Elizabeth Maria Ochterlony's family comes from. And it introduced me to a landscape I've never paid any attention to. I know nothing of southern Perthshire. I tend to head extreme north and extreme west, or Moray. And I had lost this in translation. And Robin explained to me that this landscape was the landscape before the train. This was the one you could get to and work in. And it was also the place where there's some very wealthy patrons and their estates. And an artist would want those sorts of connections in order to flourish and thrive. So this is the Fall on the Turret. And it's the specificity of the scene, but also what I like is this Fuseli-like, strange, organic foreground. The Fall on the Tummel. The Upper Fall of Brewer. And the Falls of Monas, which are the ones above the Birks of Aberfeldy. And then his later work from 1840, The Land of Burns, a series of landscapes and portraits illustrative of the life and writings of the Scottish poet. And this is a scene of the Devon on Rumbling Bridge. And effectively what Robin introducing me to these images and me being drawn particularly to these images in the collection, this is how that line in the landscape I mentioned began to emerge and become clearer and clearer to me. It began to be an itinerary. And stitched into that itinerary was another document which was fundamental to my work in the residency, which is Scotia Depicta, or the Antiquities, Castles, Public Buildings, Noblemen and Gentlemen's Seats, Cities, Towns and Picturesque Scenery of Scotland, 1804. This is Fall on the Tilt. This document is where Robin really introduced me to this other world of how artists survived and prospered. This would have been a world where a speculative inquiry would have led to the drawing of a sketch and then an introduction to his lordship and saying, your lordship's policies are magnificent. I have drawn them just for the pure beauty of them. However, would you like to sponsor a collection of drawings which some other noblemen have sponsored, which will be published and will demonstrate to the world how fine your landscape is? This is, as I mentioned, this is a Fall on the Tilt. it became another part of my itinerary. In fact, one of the things that I noticed in particular is obviously different times of year, different landscapes, but this isn't actually a waterfall. That building on the left still exists. What it was a mill race, and it's an offshoot of the River Fender, which is higher up. So when the mill was working, when the estate was this vigorous, well, the estate at Blair Athol is still pretty vigorous, but when it was using the mill to grind corn for the village and the estate, then the water would have been churning through this, hence this apparent waterfall. But now it's a bucolic, quiet little village, which houses a lot of people who work on the estate, but is silenced. This is Ganache Bridge, which is a little bit north of Edsall, which is a demonstration of the remarkable engineering of a bridge sponsored by a local nobleman. Again, an extraordinary geology. And this is a waterfall at Dainira, which is the estate of Henry Dundas, 1st Viscount of Melville, who is increasingly familiar to us now and only really hit my attention a couple of years ago. I think this was an exercise in purely making contact with his lordship, with his almost unfathomable range of power. So that became my itinerary, and that became my line in the landscape, and that became the motivation for designs for a rock room. And these are some of the drawings. The drawings are about the size of the sheets are imperial size, but they're just a little off the size of an A1. And they document the extraordinary geologies of these sites. And they fill enough of a wall to fill one's vision and perhaps stand in a little for Dr. Hutton's losses with the loss of his collection. And I'll just go through these images slowly. These are details that follow. The burial ground on the Marm Road is the drawing that Sandy referenced, and it's my particular response to the Dainira estate, the waterfall at Dainira. The drawing is part of the Trinity Buoy Wharf shortlist, and it's on tour at the moment. It's presently at Trinity Buoy Wharf. I went on a very hot day. I'd been very unwilling to visit this site because the website was quite off-putting. It's a shooting estate, and there's wording which always makes me think that a gamekeeper is going to shout at a beak, maybe take a pot shot at me. So I checked with a ranger friend for my land access rights, and I went on a particularly humid day, having tried to enter by a back door, which was ostensibly the extreme west of the estate. And as I was going up, this caught my eye, the tiny railing that you see in the centre of the image. And I wouldn't have noticed it, and I didn't know it was the Marm Road, which was an old drove road. And I went and looked further, and this is the burial ground of the scions of the Dundas family. Henry Dundas is buried at Maswade, but this is the family who are attached to the estate. It's no longer part of the Dundas family estate, or the Dukes of Melville. And it's incredibly overgrown, wonderfully caught in birch, silver birch, well, downy birch, a pioneer species. But then the yew that was planted, as was the tradition, have also gone rogue. They've jumped the wall is in the foreground. And the whole place carries with it, particularly on a humid summer day, a weight of anxiety as a place. I've begun to think increasingly as I've moved through landscapes that what we do as humans marks them in so many different ways, and some of them aren't absolutely explicit. Another piece of work attached to that discomfort at Dainira is the waterfall at Dainira, revisited. It was in low water at the time, and I have for some time been drawing on things, and this is one of those instances of drawing a waterfall. The last character in my fantastic dinner invitation of 4 people is James Naismith, son of Alexander Naismith and famous as the inventor of the steam hammer. James Naismith was a correspondent of David Octavius Hill, and as I mentioned, Robin and Sandy gave me access to Hill's letters. Of course, during a time when you haven't got any other way of communicating, there were an awful lot of letters. Some of them would be missives sent across the city by a messenger, and some of them were more extensive, expansive narratives. Hill seems to have devoted much of his time to making sure that the widows of artists who died, or artists who were ill, or artists who were on hard times, were put in the way of opportunities for patronage. But he also maintained a healthy correspondence with James Naismith, and he was a friend of Alexander Naismith. And his correspondence with Naismith, one of the ones that struck me most, was a lovely exchange about photography and the moon. So James Naismith, remarkable engineer, was fascinated by astronomy. If he wasn't doing the work of an engineer, he was looking at the stars and waiting for his moment of retirement. And he's terribly excited by Hill and Adamson's work in photography, his sun pictures. And he promises himself, and he's saying this in the letter, that as soon as the hammer, his steam hammer, is silenced, as soon as he retires, he will use this new sun picture technique to begin to explain the landscape that he sees through his telescope at night. And the image on the screen is one of the things that he learned from his father, Alexander Naismith, who used to make models. So when people were being taught, and Mrs. Cumming, Elizabeth Maria Ortoloni, would have possibly been using some of these when she was being taught by Naismith's daughter, Charlotte, I think, would have used the models to work with shadow on landscapes, because you would have done sketching on site, but you would have been developing paintings in the workshop. And these here are plaster casts with water dropped onto them to begin to evoke the images of what he was seeing through his telescope. And he made them with a view to photographing them for the publication that came out when that steam hammer was finally silenced. And the publication is called The Moon Considered as a Planet, a World, and a Satellite. And these are the images, which are the most remarkable illusion. I think that they would never have been proposed as an illusion. They're intended as an illustration of something seen, but they are, to a certain degree, something of a hoax. And that fascination with the moon, with the stars, led me in a number of directions. One of them is lunarity. I have for some time hoped that I would be able to make an orrery, a model of the planets. And the opportunity of the residency gave me the wherewithal and the time to do that. These are the raw materials of lunarity, mainly sugar spoons of different kinds. And this is the work. It is rather like Joseph Wright's image, something which must be illuminated by the sun from the left. The idea of a hoax, of stories of going to the moon, similarly caught my imagination, and I stumbled upon, when thinking about moon hoaxes, the unparalleled adventures of one Hans Pfaall. Edgar Allan Poe shared I think this is probably the only thing I share with Edgar Allan Poe. It's a facility for making things when you get a bit annoyed. And he was very annoyed by the great moon hoax of 1835 that claimed that people in a civilization existed on the moon and proof had been found. And in response to that, he wrote this short story, which was published in the Southern Literary Messenger in June of 1835. And it is the story of a man who travels to the moon and sends back a message 5 years later to apologize for his behavior on Earth and to explain his adventure. In the course of preparation for his flight, Hans Pfaall, who was a bellows maker, who'd been very successful in Amsterdam in the 17th century, but had suddenly found that his creditors had turned on him and made his life miserable. So he decided to apply his bellows making skill to making himself a balloon. And he would have gone through so many failures along the way in trying to design a mode of flight that would take him up into the sky. He would have created boneyards of broken, failed, fragmentary architectures. And then it would have worked. And he would have made something, and did make something, according to Edgar Allan Poe, that would take him to the moon. It would have been weathered, and indeed was weathered, torn by the winds, delaminated, deconstructed, and ultimately crashed. But during his journey, it would have remained intact for some time until it was stretched and distorted out of all recognition. Pfaall perfected his balloon, and one evening, strangely with the help of his creditors, he set about taking flight. Unfortunately, an explosion attended upon his exit, which killed his creditors. This was the crime for which he wanted to apologize 5 years later. He moved up into the night sky and over between 16 and 19 days, traveled across the world, heading closer and closer to the moon. He passed over fleets in open sea. He left ballast, in his case, a ballast of feathers floating in the ether. He traveled over the North Pole, the moon constantly in sight. He passed over northern islands. I took these to be the Faroe Islands. And eventually he crashed and landed on the moon, a planet peopled by folk of a diminutive stature who did indeed build fine citadels and civilizations. And it was here, with his balloon gradually melting into the dusty landscape, that he resided until he sent one of the members of the local population in a small balloon back down to earth, not to touch ground. The balloon was made out of old newspapers, to deliver his missive, describing his journey and requesting forgiveness for the murder of his creditors. The very last piece of work I'd like to show you is Nymphaeum. I mentioned at the beginning that two large film pieces bookend my work in the residency, in the collections. The first one was Museum, a landscape in a room. This is Nymphaeum, rooms in a landscape. It's a study of that line in the landscape I mentioned, which I now realise I never named. It's the Highland boundary fault line, which I really should have known about. A series of extraordinary stone chambers, waterfalls, which are caused by a singular heated line diagonally across the landscape from Stonehaven to Staffa. In the course of making this work, I was telling a friend today, I would sit in waterfalls that I had climbed down into. I risk assessed, I decided it was risky and I did it anyway. And I would sit for 2 or 3 hours, sometimes more, in these waterfalls recording footage. And the consequence of that was, for days afterwards, my ears would roar and all I could see was falling water or violent, succulent green. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. That was fascinating. I really enjoyed just discovering the paths that you'd kind of trodden around the collections, the kind of archaeological dig, as it was really of exploring everything and through your own eyes, I guess, discovering those origins of landscape art through the RSA's collections, discovering, I suppose, the origins of your own practice and how they all link together. I wonder, I'm having a look to see if there's any questions in the chat at the moment. There's nothing in there yet, but do feel free to add anything in if there's anything you'd like to ask. I'm wondering, Victoria, is there anything, I was having a look through all the different things that you accessed when you came into Granton to have a look through the collections. Was there something in particular that really stood out, or was everything as interesting as the next?
No, those letters. Oh gosh, you get feedback from my voice. The letters were outstanding. They were just a window into a world I haven't thought about. In terms of artifacts, I really liked Francis Gross's very small studies and engravings, etchings. What did I? To be honest with you, it was just a Pandora. It wasn't Pandora's box. It was just an extraordinary opening out of possibilities for me. Robin one day explained to me the purpose of the collection. I kind of knew, but it hadn't really, the penny hadn't dropped. I think we were talking about, I had read about Horatio McCulloch, and I had read that at some point he moved to Cadzo near Chateau Herald, so the Duke of Hamilton's estate. And the Duke of Hamilton had a collection of Raphaels. And that's when it struck me that people didn't have, they couldn't, now I am drowned in references. I can look up any picture I want to look up sitting in my living room, or in fact on the bus on my phone. And yet these folk didn't have those things. So the collections became, it is a teaching thing and it's a learning thing. And so much of the collections were collected, maybe less so now, I don't know, you could probably input on that. Obviously you could input on that, but they seem to be all about offering resources to people. And I felt like that. I felt that had suddenly happened to me, that this other way of thinking had, and this other way of thinking about images that weren't, is it called Pinterest, that weren't so cheap and easy.
I think it's an interesting insight in that all the imagery that's held within the collection, some of it more obvious and accessible than other imagery. The paintings that are probably people are more familiar with, or can be, I guess, can be discovered by an audience in a single point of contact, whereas what's hidden in books, and a lot of the albums that you were looking at, you mentioned Scotia Depicta, there's things like Theatrum Scotiae, there's the William Daniel Voyages round Scotland, of which we have one copy, which I remember you drawing from in the same way that you were drawing in the museum. We have some images of you drawing from that album, which has that geological children have just start shouting in the background just at the moment to put me off. But that way of exploring that imagery, I think, is something that I remember you being, just extremely in awe of when you were in the collections.
Yeah, I kept looking at, I always seem to be looking at the edges of things rather I can fill any gap in the conversation. I was always looking at the edges of things. So in the books that Sandy was showing me, the Danielle, the Gross, the folios, I was always finding my way to the rocks, really. And as soon as I started looking at the rocks, it was never looking at the whole composition of a picture, what was held or contained within the frame, but just moving up, which is why I showed that image of the edge of the Cullens in the Danielle, because that's what interested me most, was those extraordinary evocative moments in the edges of a composition rather than the whole. I'm trying to think. No, I loved looking at there's a whole body of work I didn't include because 40 minutes is 40 minutes. But I was also looking at the plans of the academy, and you gave me access to the old the books of exhibitors before data protection. So it had their addresses, and these were people who would also teach in there. So the new town to me became this extraordinary landscape. It was like when everything else was going on, and I was going for a walk through the new town. I was walking in 1820 Newtown, 1830 Newtown. Couldn't feel the dust under my feet like Mrs. Cumming, but I was walking past her house. I was walking past, it doesn't exist, and it took me ages to find any plans, 33 Abercrombie Place, where the life classes were taught. I would go up to York Place. I'd even go up to Rock House, and just my own universe was at work as a consequence of that. But you kindly gave me access to the plans of the Royal Scottish Academy, and Gillian Mackay, Dr. Gillian Mackay, geologist, she took me on my first ever urban geology field trip around the building. And it was astonishing because she just described a city made of sand. So institutions don't count and architecture doesn't count because Edinburgh is sand. It's an ocean turned to stone. And she was pointing out the critters and how the quarrymen had cut things. So whether we were looking in section at the lines of different layers of what Rachel Carson called the long snowfall, or the detritus, which ultimately becomes sandstone. And she, on the steps inside, the marble steps of the main entrance to the Royal Scottish Academy, she was pointing out bivalves to me in the marble. And so it was another way of looking, and that was in part drawn through. Well, what I missed was, and it's in that picture back there, is I'm so sorry the library's gone, because it looked like a remarkable room with the collection held within, you know, accessible in a utterly different way. I mean, I love that big room, in that shed down by the water that you've got, but there is something remarkable in being able to sit amongst them on a regular basis, I think.
I think that's something that, you know, those who might visit the RSA now, those who haven't, I guess, had experience of the building in its past lives as such. You know, there's obviously there's probably very few around who have been in the library as it was previously, although the room did exist in one way, shape or form up until the end of the 20th century. But as you know, as you said earlier, that library was really formed as a teaching aid for artists, for students in the art, for students of architecture, to support practitioners in developing their practice. And I think it's, you know, it does exist, and it's perhaps more hidden now, and we are making efforts to try and make it more accessible digitally and online. And there are interesting breadcrumbs that will hopefully result from that kind of access as well. You mentioned Werner, and it was, you know, it brought to mind, and I can't remember whether you accessed this when you were on the residency, but the Patrick Syme's Nomenclature of Colours, which was after Werner's Nomenclature of Colours, which is a fascinating little album that we have, which is that it's accessible on our website through our bookshelf that we've got on there, and we're hoping to make more books like that accessible in that way. But I think that 6 degrees of separation that you talked about, and how you've trodden that path around the different characters in the collections, Elizabeth Exterloni, for example. I think for me, having, and Robin, as you said, being able to put a name, a proper name, you know, to give that woman an identity that she so, you know, fully deserved with the talent that she had. I think Nasmyth, or, you know, her copies of Nasmyth's work have been recognized as the ones that were, you know, the most proficient of his students at the time. And for her not even to have a proper name for, you know, nearly 200 years after she was painting, it's just, I mean, that outcome of the residency, apart from the amazing work that you've produced, is it's amazing in itself.
But that is down for my very strange facility for going on walks about the city and bumping into extraordinary people, and then going, oh, hang on a minute, and chancing my arm by asking. And it's down to Caroline. I mean, Robin had done so much work, but Caroline, it was well, you were there because you were CC'd in, and sometimes the object of it. It was this extraordinary wall of information, which is, I hope somebody else will pick up, because there's a book in there and possibly a film. Not for me. My work here is done. But when I was talking about it to people over the last few months, I said, there's always this world of the glass ceiling, but there is just a great feeling when you reach your hand behind you and you pull somebody into the light. And I've never done it before. And it felt like that. And at that moment, that gutter moment was something like, it was, when I finally read the email, it was something like 9:30 on a Saturday morning in my mum's living room. And I started to cry. And I don't do that easily. So it was, yeah, it was important.
And we're hoping to have a residency exhibition. We've missed out on a lot of what the residency artists have been doing since 2019 because of COVID. We're hoping to be able to give a platform for people to discover your work and other artists who've been on the Residencies for Scotland programme at some point in 2022, and our programme's still being confirmed. But I'm looking forward to seeing how things might come together. Do you see the residency as really, as taking your work in a different direction as the directions it's been before, or is it feeding into a kind of melee of everything that has gone previously, now, and in the future?
I think parts of it are threads that they've been there before, but I think that ability to operate inside of a cloud, as opposed to, I can be a bit of a heap. I'm a very well organized person. You can see those drawers. I haven't tidied especially. And I think something about that cloud and your direction and wonderful misdirection have pointed me at places. So Southern Persia, didn't know. And there are other places as well, which I wanted to get to, but it kept being things like the boat's got to be out of the water, and when the boat could go back, I found the man with a boat to take me to a place I wanted to go to. And then nobody could go anywhere. So there were those things, those new places to see. But I think in terms of drawing, you mentioned it, and I've said it about myself, that drawing's a constant. I mean, I really am I'm an outcome of my foundation course, which was in Blackpool, which was driven by drawing. But I am very much a byproduct of my time at Edinburgh College of Art and my drawing classes with folk. Well, the one that really took me in hand was Elizabeth Ogilvie, but everybody else subsequently is that I'm now making worlds of drawings as well, which I don't think I did before. The drawings would always run in parallel, but I wouldn't give people that much, not intentionally. I want to show my work, but it was always that the films came first. And I think there's a different set of relationships. The films are still extremely important, but there's a leveling up that's gone on there. And then making, I've never done anything with 3D printing. Richard Collins, masterpiece. Our constant conversations were how to make the process fail, because it's a very accurate process, but I wasn't interested in that. And you can see that in the distortions of what I made. We just kept thinking, how do we dial down on the precision here, but still make it something that exists? And making the orrery, the lunarity, that was never cast anything, never soldered in my life. I've been taught, I've got instructions, but I haven't done it yet on how to stitch leather. All these things which are still going on. It's not finished. I think you'll see me again. And some of the other collections of Edinburgh better brace themselves, really, because there are so many things to be looked at, and they point you in so many directions. And what I like about them all is that they're very rarely the official version. So the gossip about James Hutton, that's what interests me, the stories that fall off the edge, that aren't official, that come up in anecdote and apocrypha.
Yeah, and the collections are storers and harbourers of all those stories, some official, some less official, some that slip between the cracks, others that paper over the cracks or try to. And I think the way that you've pulled some of those hidden stories out into the light has been, it's been a joy to behold for me, and having such an investment in the collection. in one, from one perspective, seeing different artists mine those collections in the archives in the library in their own ways and bringing their own insights into that is always, you know, it's always really interesting to see the outcomes. And you know, it's been frustrating, I think, to have to wait this long to see where it was all going. But you know, I feel privileged, along with the friends and the patrons of the Academy, to have this little this sneak peek into how things are progressing. And I think we'll be really excited to see how it all comes together next year. I think that's us reached 8 o'clock, so I think we can wrap up there. I'd just like to thank you very much, Victoria, for presenting to us today. I'll finish off. There weren't any questions left, but I'll finish off with a message from Kate Downey, who said, "Imagine a whole audience standing up and clapping. Thank you so much for weaving such an incredible tale of your journey across time, across Scotland, through these past lives." So thank you very much, Victoria. I think we will leave it there, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you for joining us tonight.